Hello and welcome to the channel. Today's a special one, and as usual, we're diving deep into British politics with a touch of irreverence and a bit of cheeky humor. Always from the opposition, of course, like the good journalist I am, firmly standing on the other side of the fence, watching what's going on in Westminster and beyond. If you're someone who enjoys a proper debate, some juicy headlines, and fresh news, you've come to the right place. Don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe, because there's always something interesting on the agenda here. Let's crack on. In the bustling heart of Westminster, the House of Commons was alive with a rather extraordinary scene. A Home Office minister, usually cool and composed, found themselves locked in a war of words that could rival the fiercest of parliamentary showdowns. The issue at hand was straightforward, or at least it should have been. The request, made by the opposition, was simple. Disclose the figures on the cost of providing benefits and council houses to asylum seekers. Now, one might think this is precisely the kind of transparency we ought to expect from our government, particularly when it involves the hard-earned taxpayers' money. But oh, how wrong one would be. The Home Office minister, looking slightly uncomfortable but standing firm, rejected the request outright. The words fell from their lips with a tone that suggested they weren't entirely pleased to be called out on the matter. "I'm not going to entertain these baseless accusations," the minister declared, almost sneering at the opposition's demands. "You know full well, this data is far too complex. Without the proper context, any attempt at publishing these figures will only lead to misunderstandings." The opposition benches, not one to shy away from a good confrontation, were immediately on their feet, demanding answers, shouting across the chamber. "This is exactly why we need the data. We deserve to know exactly how much of our money is being spent on this. If the government is serious about being transparent, why can't they release these figures?" A senior opposition MP challenged, their voice booming through the hall, cutting through the tension in the air. The minister, clearly rattled, adjusted their papers and, with a flourish that only politicians seem to master, launched into a defensive tirade. "Let's not forget," they began, almost smugly, "the opposition's track record on handling public funds leaves much to be desired. Who was it that spent £700 million on sending a handful of volunteers to Rwanda, Who oversaw the backlogs and left people stranded in hotels for months?" The room was silent for a moment, before the opposition benches erupted into a chorus of angry protests. "Are we to accept," the Home Office minister continued, "that every time we disagree, the opposition will throw stones from their glass house? They've failed to deliver on their own promises, and now they expect us to hand over sensitive data that could be misused." A ripple of frustration spread through the opposition as the response seemed to miss the mark entirely. "We're not talking about a game of tit for tat," one opposition MP shot back, shaking their head in disbelief. "This is about transparency, about accountability. You can't just deflect every question by bringing up the past. We need to know how much this government's policies are costing us, especially when it involves something as important as housing and benefits for asylum seekers. The people have a right to know how their money is being spent." The Home Office minister, no stranger to political battles, tried to regain control of the debate, but the cracks in their argument were becoming more apparent. "The issue is not the cost. The issue is that the data is far too nuanced. You simply won't understand the implications of publishing it without proper context," they countered, their tone now dripping with a mix of frustration and condescension. "Proper context?" came the sharp retort from across the aisle. "Are you saying the public isn't capable of understanding the truth? We're not asking for some complex, encrypted code. We're asking for basic numbers, basic facts, and you're hiding behind a wall of bureaucracy." As the exchange raged on, the room became an arena of political posturing. On one side, the opposition, hungry for transparency, demanding that the government show their cards. On the other, the government, attempting to shield itself with claims of complexity and misinterpretation. But the reality was becoming clearer by the second. The government had no intention of making these figures public, and the opposition wasn't going to let it slide. Now, let's take a step back here, shall we? What's going on is a classic example of the political gamesmanship that's all too familiar in Westminster. The government doesn't want to release the figures, not because they're too complex, but because they know that the numbers might not look great. They don't want the public to see the true cost of their policies, especially when it comes to something as sensitive as asylum seekers. And frankly, who can blame them? Transparency, when it shines a light on uncomfortable truths, is often the last thing a government wants. But let's not sugarcoat it, shall we? The opposition, while rightly calling for transparency, are hardly in a position to lecture anyone on accountability, are they? After all, the political establishment in the UK is infamous for its cozy little deals, its questionable spending, and its inability to take responsibility for much of anything. The opposition wants the government to open up the books, but they're hardly leading by example, are they? Show us the figures. Show us the numbers, shouted another opposition MP, as they slammed their hand on the desk in frustration. What are you hiding? What don't you want us to see? The Home Office Minister looked over at the opposition, a faint smirk playing on their lips. You can shout all you want, they said, voice steady but tinged with annoyance, but the truth is, these figures are not for public consumption. Not without proper context, not without a thorough understanding of the ramifications. It was at this moment that the full absurdity of the situation hit home. The minister was, in effect, arguing that the public wasn't capable of understanding the data. But we all know that's a convenient excuse to avoid scrutiny. The minister's job is to defend government policy, no matter how shaky the foundations. And the opposition's job? Well, it's to dig in their heels, to ask the tough questions, to push for accountability, even when they know the answers might be inconvenient. But here's the kicker. What is actually being hidden here? Why are the costs of housing asylum seekers in council homes, providing benefits, and supporting their integration so difficult to calculate? Surely, in a modern, transparent democracy, this information should be easily accessible. After all, it's the taxpayers' money we're talking about. The idea that these numbers are somehow too complex for public consumption is not just laughable, it's insulting. It's a classic case of a government trying to keep the public in the dark while it plays its usual game of political smoke and mirrors. And so the debate rages on. The opposition insists that the government must release the figures, demanding the transparency that we all deserve. The minister, meanwhile, continues to hide behind a veil of bureaucracy, arguing that the figures are too complex to make public without misleading the public. And somewhere in the middle, the British public waits, wondering just how much their money is being spent on policies they don't fully understand. But one thing is crystal clear. Without these numbers, it's almost impossible for anyone, whether in the opposition or the government, to make informed decisions about the effectiveness of asylum policies. Transparency isn't just a buzzword, it's the foundation of democracy. Without it, we're all just guessing. And that, my friends, is not a game anyone should want to play.